What if I told you Hollywood didn't just ignore Joan Rivers? They tried to erase her? Behind the glitz, the laughs, and the red carpet zingers, there's a scandal so deep, even her closest fans don't know the half of it. From powerful enemies to being blacklisted at the peak of her fame. This is the untold story Hollywood hoped you'd forget. Stick around, because once you hear what really happened, you'll never see Joan Rivers the same way again. She arrived late, breathless with apology, but there was more behind those words than simple tardiness. "I'm so sorry," she said, trying to catch up to a moment that had already left her behind. He stood still, cold, and replied, "I waited too long." That brief exchange would echo louder than anyone imagined, because what followed wasn't just heartbreak. It was the unraveling of a legend. One decision cost Joan Rivers everything. In 1986, she took a gamble, leaving NBC to host her own late-night show on Fox. It was bold, it was unprecedented, and it was fatal to her career. Her mentor, Johnny Carson, who had once told her she was destined to be a star, never spoke to her again. Doors slammed. Hollywood turned icy. Big names stopped calling. Some networks quietly refused to carry her show. And within just a few months, Fox let her go. Then, as if fate hadn't dealt enough pain, a deeply personal tragedy shattered what remained of her stability. She found herself mocked in fake interviews, even as she mourned. Her sorrow turned into a punchline. And yet, through it all, she refused to disappear. To understand the woman behind the microphone, you have to go back to Brooklyn, 1933. Born Joan Alexandra Malinsky to Russian Jewish immigrants, she grew up on Doctors Row, where the streets were safe, the neighbors familiar, and dreams felt just out of reach. Her father, a respected doctor with a love for jokes, may have planted the earliest seeds of humor in her life. But Joan always wanted more than laughter around the dinner table. She dreamed of Manhattan's blinding lights and bigger stages. Even as a child, she was reaching. At age 8, she mailed her photo to MGM Studios, convinced someone would discover her. Teachers noted her chatter, her passion for drama, and her unwillingness to be ordinary. She was vice president of her high school drama club by 16, and already eyeing the exit ramp from Brooklyn. When she got to college, first at Connecticut, then Barnard, she poured herself into everything: anthropology, English literature, theater. She graduated Phi Beta Kappa in 1954, smart and ready to conquer the world. But the real world didn't exactly open its arms. Her first job was behind a department store counter. She married briefly, divorced just as fast, and realized something crucial. Normalcy didn't suit her. The stage kept calling. The spotlight, even when faint, felt like oxygen. At 25, still unknown and struggling, Joan was cobbling together a life. She gave Rockefeller tours, edited ads, and sold clothes. Her agent suggested a new name, something punchier: Joan Rivers. And from that moment on, Joan Rivers became the armor. She often said the real her, Joan Malinsky, stayed backstage, nervous, uncertain. But Joan Rivers, the performer, charged ahead, no matter how hard the crowd. In the early days, show business didn't want her. She auditioned, bombed, tried again. Her first shot on The Tonight Show with Jack Paar was a misfire. She didn't just fail, she crashed. And for 7 years, she clawed her way through rejection. Her days were filled with cattle call auditions and cheap headshots. Nights were spent in comedy clubs where audiences barely looked up from their drinks. By the time she was 31, whispers began. Maybe she missed her moment. While names like Woody Allen and George Carlin were taking off, Joan Rivers was stuck in the shadows. Her comedy trio fell apart. Her marriage dissolved. And still, she pressed forward. She tried different personas, even performing as Pepper January. Sometimes she borrowed material just to get by. One of her first real gigs was at a Boston burlesque club, where attention was rare and approval scarcer. Even Fred Weintraub of The Bitter End gave her multiple chances, but audiences didn't respond. She wasn't funny yet. But Joan was learning. Every silence taught her timing. Every cold crowd toughened her skin. By 1961, she tried her luck in Chicago's Second City Improv troupe. It was brutal. Male performers resented her ambition. They didn't like that she wanted to steal scenes or get the laughs. But she didn't flinch. It was in those hostile rooms that her trademark wit and resilience began to crystallize. Then, on a cold night in February 1965, everything changed. After years of closed doors and bitter coffee shop rewrites, she was given a second chance on The Tonight Show. This time, Johnny Carson was hosting. And when Joan finished her set, he did something unthinkable. He invited her over to the desk. That small gesture was seismic. "You're going to be a star," he said. In that instant, Joan's life was rewritten. Critics who had once dismissed her now lined up with praise. Time magazine compared her to Woody Allen, marveling at her range. Suddenly, Joan Rivers was everywhere. Talk shows, writers' rooms, comedy specials. The star everyone said was too old had just begun to rise. She became Carson's regular guest host by 1983, appearing nearly 100 times. And while NBC would never let her take the full reins permanently, Joan still broke barriers, holding that space longer than any woman before her. In 1984, she hosted The Tonight Show's first stereo broadcast, small by today's standards, but at the time a sign she was pushing television into the future. And she wasn't just winning on the small screen. Las Vegas loved her. Her act became a mainstay on the Strip, where she performed for 43 years. What began as a joke in Brooklyn had become a glittering empire. But Hollywood remembers risks and punishments more than victories. And Joan's biggest risk was yet to come. She used to joke that she'd become the town bicycle of the Strip because she'd work for anyone who'd hire her. But beneath the punchlines was a pioneer reshaping what comedy could look like in sequins and heels. In 1969, she first touched down in Las Vegas, performing at the Riviera with John Davidson. But 1972 was the year that changed everything. When Joan Rivers took the stage at Caesar's Palace, she wasn't just another act. She declared, without apology, that funny didn't have to mean frumpy. While others leaned into slapstick and gimmicks, Joan showed up looking sharp and glamorous. "I was the first one that said, 'Try to look good,'" she once said proudly, challenging a system that rarely allowed women to own their image and their wit at the same time. Night after night, she held her own next to icons like Diana Ross and Anne Margaret, an unprecedented accomplishment for a female comic in the male-dominated Vegas circuit. From 1983 to 1991, she remained a fixture at Caesars, teaming up with acts like the Smothers Brothers and Gary Shandling. Even when she wasn't performing full-time, Vegas pulled her back. Her last shows at the Venetian in 2012 proved her spotlight never dimmed. But her talent didn't stop at the microphone. Just 3 years after her Tonight Show debut, Joan stepped behind a different kind of desk. In 1968, she launched That Show with Joan Rivers, a daytime talk show that looked nothing like anything else on television. Each episode had its own theme, opening with Joan's biting monologue before she brought on a celebrity and an expert to dive deep into the topic. Johnny Carson himself appeared as her first guest. Jerry Lewis, Don Rickles, Joel Grey. They all followed. The show only lasted 2 years, but it laid the foundation for what daytime television would become. Joan, in her own irreverent way, was building the scaffolding for an entire generation of hosts to come. It was during one of her Vegas stints in the 1980s when 3 words slipped out of her mouth that would become stitched into pop culture history. "Can we talk?" It came after a particularly bold joke about Elizabeth Taylor's weight left the room gasping. Joan paused and asked the crowd that question, not as a comeback, but as an invitation. And just like that, Those words became her calling card. It wasn't just a phrase. It was a permission slip to be real, to share the raw truths behind the laughs. She wasn't up there preaching. She was confiding in you, like an old friend whispering secrets across the kitchen table. The legacy of those 3 words lingered far beyond the applause. Even after her death in 2014, they echoed in tributes, interviews, and sermons. Rabbi Sarah Schendelman said it best. Joan's gift wasn't just the punchlines, it was the way she made people feel seen. Can we talk? Wasn't about the joke. It was about trust. But in 1986, the trust Joan had built in Hollywood was about to be shattered. At the height of her fame, she made a choice that would cost her everything. For years, she had been Johnny Carson's go-to guest host on The Tonight Show, nearly 100 appearances a year. To many, she was the heir apparent. But while Johnny propped her up in public, something else was brewing behind closed doors. Barry Diller, the executive behind the fledgling Fox network, offered Joan the unthinkable, her own late-night show, the first of its kind led by a woman. She took the deal, terrified that Carson would pull the rug out from under her if he found out. She called him 8 times the weekend before the announcement. He never picked up. When the news hit, the damage was done. Carson felt betrayed. Their 23-year friendship vanished overnight. He never spoke to her again. Still, Joan pressed forward. The contract with Fox was worth $10 million, a fortune at the time, and included a position for her husband Edgar Rosenberg as the show's producer. It seemed like a power move, history in the making. But from its very first night, The Late Show with Joan Rivers was under siege. Carson banned any guest who appeared on her show. Stations near his hometown refused to air it. Affiliates were allowed to opt out, and many did. Fox began to panic. The ratings dipped, the pressure built. Then came the ultimatum: fire Edgar or lose everything. Joan refused. On May 15, 1987, they were both fired. That final episode was chaos: shaving cream, wild guests, unfiltered madness. Joan packed the night with Howie Mandel, Pee Wee Herman, and a young Chris Rock. Her stage manager even showed up dressed like a manic version of himself. It felt like a woman fighting against the tide with every ounce of breath she had left. Just 91 days later, the tide took something far more personal. Edgar Rosenberg, her husband and producer, was found dead in a Philadelphia hotel room. The shock sent ripples through every inch of Joan's life. Edgar had never truly recovered from a heart attack in 1984 and had been spiraling since. Joan, already devastated, soon discovered that their finances were in ruins. He'd left her $37 million in debt. At her absolute lowest, Joan stood on the edge. What pulled her back wasn't fame, or money, or even family. It was her tiny dog, Spike, jumping into her lap at just the right moment. That flicker of unconditional love reminded her that even in darkness, there's something left to fight for. But the world didn't ease up. GQ published a fake interview, quoting her making cruel jokes about Edgar. Ben Stein, who had never even met her, wrote it. Joan took him and the magazine to court and won. Every cent of the settlement went to charity. But the damage, the betrayal, it carved deep. She later confessed she felt like she didn't exist anymore, a ghost in the very industry she helped shape. But ghosts don't come back. Joan Rivers did. She stood beneath the spotlight, not for her show, not for ratings, but for a moment of raw emotional truth. Joan Rivers, defiant and trembling, held her Emmy as tears slid down her cheeks. Just 2 years earlier, she had been struggling to find work. Her income had dropped, and whispers filled the industry that she was finished. But that night, she wasn't just accepting an award. She was reclaiming her legacy. "This is for Edgar," she said, speaking to the memory of her late husband, who had stood beside her when everything began. It wasn't just grief. It was her final word to every doubter who thought her career had ended in shadows. It was a full-circle triumph, burning with personal fire. Few knew the weight behind her smile that evening. Joan had once been Hollywood's golden insider, until she dared step away from Carson and paid the price. For decades, The Tonight Show shut its doors on her. That invisible exile hung over her like smoke, until Jimmy Fallon reopened that door in 2014. Her return, brief but bold, was like a time machine snapping shut. One last fearless joke, one last defiant glance, and then silence. But her journey from banishment to standing ovation was more than just a comeback. It was a reckoning. Even during the darkest days of her career, Joan never vanished. She slipped into unexpected roles, like voicing the sarcastic robot Dot Matrix in Spaceballs, poking fun at sci-fi with the same irreverence she used on the red carpet. That 1987 performance, Face Unseen, Only Her Voice, became a cult favorite, long after its lukewarm box office debut. She had a way of showing up when you least expected her, in forms nobody saw coming. In 1994, she made perhaps her boldest move, a Broadway drama based on the mother of Lenny Bruce. The stage wasn't kind, reviews were split, but critics couldn't ignore her ferocity. Joan didn't flinch from hard stories. That same year, she co-starred in a heartbreaking TV film with her daughter Melissa about their shared grief after Edgar's death. She transformed personal loss into national storytelling. That vulnerability was her superpower, always sharp, always raw, never filtered. When she brought her energy to E!'s red carpet coverage in 1996, it was more than a career pivot. It was a revolution. She turned star-studded arrivals into high-stakes fashion commentary. Her question, "Who are you wearing?" was ridiculed at first, but she doubled down. Audiences loved it, and the entire industry shifted. She and Melissa built a media empire around the glitz, the gowns, the gossip. By 2005, Joan landed an $8 million deal with TV Guide Channel. She'd turned critique into commerce, snark into serious money. Fashion Police, launched in 2010, was something she didn't even want. She thought the title sounded beneath her, but the show exploded. Each week, Joan unapologetically dissected Hollywood's elite, never sparing even the untouchable. Her comments sparked outrage, especially when she took aim at Michelle Obama or Lena Dunham, but Joan refused to retreat. She said what others whispered. That brutal honesty, whether seen as cruelty or courage, became her final brand. When animal rights activists attacked her for wearing fur, she didn't back down. Red paint on a sable coat? She laughed. Protesters crashing her book events? She snapped back with opera references and fury. Yet she wasn't all fire. She collaborated with the very activists who once targeted her, recording humorous vegan messages and supporting her daughter's nude PETA campaign. Joan lived in contradiction, and that made her real. Controversy followed her like a shadow, but she never apologized for using humor as armor. Holocaust jokes, celebrity burns, even jabs about kidnapping victims, Joan's defense remained steady. If it was true and if it was funny, it was fair game. Threats rolled in year after year. After making a joke about Polish people in 1973, she had to perform under police protection. In 2014, her vocal support for Israel during the Gaza conflict earned her renewed hostility. But she kept going. "I have no regrets," she once said, and she lived exactly that way. In 2009, at 75, she proved age meant nothing when she won The Celebrity Apprentice. Even though her rival Annie Duke raised more money, Trump chose Joan for her grit and strategy. $500,000 raised for charity later, she had a whole new generation of fans. But behind the scenes, tension brewed. Her former manager sued for millions, claiming credit for her comeback. Joan refused to give in. Fame, as she always knew, came with legal fees and betrayal. She lived loud, laughed harder, and never gave up the mic. Even now, when red carpets roll out and comedians push the limits, Joan Rivers' voice echoes beneath it all. A legacy carved not just in laughs, but in defiance, elegance, and relentless reinvention. And that's the truth behind the Joan Rivers scandal Hollywood tried to bury. If you love the drama, hit like, drop a comment, and subscribe for more untold legends. Next up, the shocking fall of another comedy icon you never saw coming. Because as Joan once said, if you don't laugh at yourself, you're missing the best joke of all.